Good morning, Warzone kids. Beautiful morning on the trail to the Western Lands. 20 degrees where I am. The roads are clear. Skies are overcast. Rosy-fingered dawn is coming up. Warzone kids is my term for those of us like myself. I'm a child sex abuse survivor. As an adult, I live with borderline personality disorder. I'm a recovering addict and bulimic. A lot of narcissism in my psyche. Warzone kids is my term for those of us like myself whose childhood resembled a guerrilla war against the psyche, against who we are, our soul, and not a supportive nursery where we got what we needed, like a plant. And I think of our psyche, our soul, our self as a Jenga tower. At the beginning of the game, the Jenga tower is a solid block made up of smaller blocks. With every turn in the game, you take one of the small blocks out and you put it on top of the big block. The game of Jenga ends when that tower comes crashing down. It's a tall, teetery thing. And if you're a Warzone kid, by the time you reach adulthood, the Jenga tower of your psyche was a tall, rickety, shaky thing. Can't look at it hard, can't step near it, don't touch it, whatever you do. And you can find yourself as a Warzone kid living your entire life in a misbegotten quest to keep that Jenga tower from falling down. Well, the best thing that can really happen to you for all of us is what happens after your Jenga tower falls down. Because then you can put it back together again. Pick up the pieces off the floor and put them back, solid this time. You don't have to rebuild that shaky Jenga tower. You can put it back in solid shape. So I think of life for us Warzone kids as a task of how do we live, answering that question. And in the search for peace and wholeness, I call that the Western Lands. I think of life as a pilgrimage to the Western Lands. They're a place of peace and wholeness where we learn and become what we are. And I think of it as a pilgrimage because that is the pilgrimage is an act of devotion where the journey is almost the same as the destination. Because for this guy, the place of peace and wholeness, and learning and becoming what I am, is in the right here and now. The ground under my feet, the step I'm taking right now, is the most important step on the trail to the Western Lands. It's not in the past, dragging the past behind me like an old woodcutter, trying to carve up the past into the shape of a key so I can unlock my happiness. Or being like a young hunter in search of the quarry, happiness. Maybe it's around this next bend in the road. I think I see it up there. You never get to the next bend around the road. Every step on the trail to the Western Lands is right where you are. Last video I made, which is just on the cusp of being too stupid for me to put out, but I'm going to put it out anyway. It's about vampires. And here's the part that got my attention while I was talking about it. Intergenerational trauma, intergenerational abuse, right? Well, there's a part of vampire folklore where the vampire has got to sleep in the dirt of its homeland. It's got to go find a sack of dirt from Wallachia or Transylvania or that island that Nadia was from in What We Do in the Shadows. An absolutely great show. If you like vampires, please go watch it if you haven't. Nadia has replaced Cersei as my image of true love. See previous video. I love Nadia. Vampires have to sleep in the dirt of their homeland. Intergenerational abuse and trauma. How do vampires get started? Somewhere something has to happen. Vampires are made by other vampires. That vampire was made by a vampire. That vampire was made by a vampire. Somewhere there had to be a first vampire. unless we postulate the eternal existence of vampires and the eternal existence of the present cosmic order, which I do not for the purposes of this video anyway. Intergenerational abuse and trauma, the dirt of the vampire's homeland, the vampire that starts it all off. Well, a disturbing part, maybe, just a little bit disturbing to me when I made it in that last video about vampires, is the idea of the familiar and the way that vampires make other vampires. And the way that in the course of being made into a vampire by a vampire, one becomes a slave to the vampire. Vampire sucks some of your blood but doesn't kill you outright and doesn't give you any of its own blood to drink. Vampires need to sustain their undeath with the blood of the living. Well, my childhood could best be thought of as living as a familiar to a couple of vampires. And I can see parts of my adult life where I tried to satiate the deprivation of love and care I had as a child. I tried to satiate that in others, trying to find the true love that would fulfill my needs. But vampires are just appetite. That's all they are. There's no satiating them. Vampires are made by other vampires. Intergenerational trauma, intergenerational abuse. If that phrase means anything to you, and you're a war zone kid, then you can see, probably, that the damage that was done to you, whatever that damage was, physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, societal abuse, for many of us, that harm came from our families, from people close to us. And as you move down the trail to the Western lands in your own quest to learn and become who you are, you may come to have a perception that the harm caused to you was caused by people who themselves were harmed and never found their way to peace and healing, or at least not in time to stop them from inflicting it on you. Whatever kind of harm that was, abuse, neglect, fill in the blank, whatever your experience was. If it was caused by a family member, if your harm was caused by a family member, I have developed the perception that those people that caused that harm were themselves very harmed. That doesn't let them off the hook. And that changes not one thing about my experience, or the fact that as a war zone kid, my task is to live here and now. And my task is to do everything I can not to pass on the harm to the next generation. Not to make more vampires. Not to instill deprivation and needs and appetite for love and care and affection and safety in others. Not to pass on the vampire virus in the form of abusing and harming and neglecting and not properly caring for the next generation. Anyone who's a parent can identify with this. That's my task. But I can have a perception that the folks that caused me harm were themselves very damaged, and they passed it down. And I know quite a bit about my family history, going back several generations. And I know that the harm caused by my folks was caused by folks who were themselves harmed. The vampire was made by other vampires that was made by another vampire that was made by another vampire. Sooner or later, somebody has to break the chain and not make any more vampires. Sooner or later, somebody in that cycle has to give up the quest for true blood, because blood is just blood, and living life like Nosferatu, who said, "I am appetite." living the life of the vampire is just living the life of the vampire. True blood is just blood. There is no synthetic true blood. It all comes from living beings. And somewhere in the story of intergenerational abuse, someone has to stop it. Someone has to do what they can not to make any more vampires. That's one of our tasks as a war zone kid. When you see, if it is true for you, if it is part of your experience, that you were caused harm by folks who were caused harm, by folks who were caused harm, by folks who were caused harm. Maybe, as happens, you're a war zone kid who grew up in a literal war zone. One of my favorite, I like UFC, it's a sport I get into. One of my favorite fighters in UFC is a fellow called Hamzat Chimaev. And he was raised as a very literal war zone kid. He's a Chechen fellow. And he grew up in the wars in Chechnya. He's an actual war zone kid, lost his father in those wars. Well, he's a war zone kid. And he's the start. If he were to just live his life and try to fulfill the needs of his childhood, I have known nothing about Hamzat Chimaev. He seems to be a happily married guy. But for the war zone kid who's the one where it starts, your task is to not start the intergenerational trail of abuse and neglect. Don't make your kid a war zone kid. Raise your kid in an environment the best you can where they get more of what they need than you did. And that's really the truth of it. If you're a war zone kid and you're raising kids of your own, you can give them more of what they need than you got. And if you're listening to this and you're putting any effort into it at all, I can tell you, you have almost certainly reared your children in a better environment than you were reared in. And that is what you can do. You can do that. There's no magic. But you can give your children more of what they need so that the appetites that they try to fill through abuse, harm, and neglect are less than what you were dealt. Does that make sense? A way that I think about this is in the way that sculptors work. Sculptors work in lots of different ways, but here's one way that they work. A sculptor can make a clay model of whatever it is. A clay model of a vampire. They make that model so it looks just like how they want. That's the original. The OG vampire. Then they take that clay model and press it into sand, wet sand. This is just one way to do it. And that sand then contains an image of the original. And they make a mold out of that wet sand. And then they fill that mold with something, molten bronze, rubber, wax. They do something. And then they have a copy of the original. The mold is kind of a reverse image of the original, a negative. And then they can make a copy of the original using that mold. Depending on what they're doing, it may take a few iterations of this process. But there is a strong analogy between that and intergenerational trauma, where often the original vampire will instill harm, abuse, neglect, appetites that are the opposite, the negative image. See, I can think of the case of a parent, it's my old man, neglected, a lot of physical abuse and neglect, chronically throughout his entire childhood. Then he was a combat machine gunner in Vietnam. More harm caused by that. He did not want his offspring, me, to experience that kind of neglect. So he smothered me to death, almost. You see, the reverse, the negative image. Severe neglect to smothering attention. In neither case, he did not get what he needed as a child, and I did not get what I needed as a child. His intentions were all for the best. This is not lost on me. But through that process, that sculpting process of casting an original and then making a negative of it, he instilled appetites in me, love and care that I did not get, being visible as a human being. I was just an image of him. There was no me. You see? Intergenerational trauma. Vampires have to sleep in the dirt of their homeland. The child of the tiger is born with stripes. That's a line from a book on intergenerational trauma I read recently. It's an interesting, it can be helpful in life to muse on this. There's no magic to it. But it can be helpful in life. It can be helpful for us war zone kids to see how we got the shape that we got. Why is my Jenga tower in the shape that it's in and not some other shape? And why, in so many ways, is the shape of my Jenga tower a negative image of the Jenga tower of the folks that caused me a lot of harm? Intergenerational trauma. Because one of the ways we perpetuate harm as war zone kids, one of the ways that we perpetuate harm is by trying to fix our childhoods in our own children. And how many of us can relate to that? Find me a parent who can't relate to that in some way. You have children and you want to pass on what you've learned about life. And if you had enough, if abuse, neglect, and damage that you took in your own childhood went past a certain threshold, you may find out that it's very important to you to do the opposite of that. And that is one way that we ourselves as war zone kids can pass on the negative image of abuse, harm, and neglect to our children. Because your child is not a reincarnation of you. I did not have my father's childhood full of neglect and physical abuse. I had my childhood. His attempts to fix his childhood in me did very little other than turn me into a negative image. He impressed the damage of his own childhood in the wet sand that was me and filled it with molten bronze and cast me in a negative version of his own image. Your child is not a reincarnation of you. What the human psyche needs in childhood is care, love, affection, consistency, safety, food, shelter. They do not need you to fix your childhood in them by trying to do the opposite. the way that we give our children a better childhood than we have is to just give them what they need, not to try to fix our childhood in them. Does that make sense? The opposite of a war zone childhood is a childhood of safety and care, not the negative image of the war zone, not by molding them into the negative of you. That's what's on my mind, thinking about vampires having to sleep in the dirt of their homeland. And the genesis of a vampire is in another vampire, and another vampire, and another vampire. And we can make vampires by using other people as food to suck their blood. And we can also make other vampires by trying to fix our own childhoods in them. But you're just making another vampire. What do you think about that? Intergenerational trauma. Let's spend the day not making vampires, war zone kids. Let's just live life as it is. And if you have kids out there, just give them what they need. They need care, they need affection, they need safety. They don't need to be a reincarnation of you. They are themselves. Let them learn and become what they are. That is the task of their life, just as it's the task of your life and my life. And all we can do today is take today's steps on the trail, boys and girls. It's a beautiful day. Daylight's burning. Let's get a move on.